Live from Washington, D.C., the George Washington National Satellite Network presents its continuing series of live seminars. Joining us today is Peter Scholtes. Mr. Scholtes will discuss a practical approach to improvement, true improvement versus the illusion of progress. Now, to introduce Mr. Scholtes is Bruce Herbert of the Continuing Engineering Education Program at the George Washington University.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce Herbert of the Continuing Engineering Education Program. Welcome to the lead-off broadcast in the George Washington University's Fall Telecast Series. The subject of today's program is a practical approach to improvement, true improvement versus the illusion of progress. Our speaker is Peter R. Scholtes. Mr. Scholtes is a colleague of Dr. W. Edwards Deming and a practitioner of the Deming Method for Quality and Productivity. He is a senior management consultant with Joyner Associates Incorporated and specializes in organizational change, team development, and training. Mr. Scholtes has consulted in management for more than 20 years. He is the author of the Team Handbook, which is internationally recognized in the field of management. Mr. Scholtes holds a master's degree in education from Boston University. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to present to you this morning Peter R. Scholtes.
Thank you, Bruce. Good morning, everybody. I'm here in Washington, D.C. with a group of people, and there are other groups of people gathered in 74 different downlink sites around the country for this seminar. The topic this morning is to talk about improvement. What's the difference between improvement and change? And mostly during the course of the day, I want to give a few important steps that change agents can undertake, and all of you are change agents. Undertake to increase the likelihood that your improvement efforts will truly be improvements and not just simply another change that makes little or no difference. There are a number of subjects that I'm not going to cover today that are important to know about, and I just want to list them off. I'm not going to be talking about a general total quality philosophy today. It's important to know about that. It's the context in which we do the improvements that we're undertaking. That includes what Dr. Deming has been emphasizing quite a bit lately, a theory of profound knowledge. It's important information, it's important material. I urge you to find out what you can about it, but we're not going to cover it today. Also, we're not covering today anything having to do with statistical tools, statistical thinking, statistical applications. I will mention a couple tools later on, but we're not going to go into any depth on the statistical tools. It's very important material. You won't be able to proceed with the application of total quality in your companies and organizations without a deep understanding of those things. We aren't going to talk about it today, but I urge you to learn what you need to learn about that elsewhere at some other time. Similarly, we're not going to be talking today about the kind of organizational structure or infrastructure that you may need in order to lead and promote total quality with your own organization. There's quite a bit that's needed in order to teach this, to lead it, to sustain it, to promote it within each company. And the tools that I'll be talking about today and the methods I'll be talking about today are important, but they need to be supported by leadership systems and organizational systems throughout. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but that too is important information that in your efforts to apply a total quality philosophy in your organizations, you need to think about and learn about. So let's begin. Let me ask a question. Think about this for a minute. Whom should we fear most? That is, which competitors should your company or should your industry or should our country fear the most? What characteristics of competition should we be most concerned about? Well, I have an answer, and it's illustrated in this graphic here that you see on the screen. I think we should fear most those who have learned how to improve faster than we have. As the diagram illustrates, we may currently be leading in quality or leading in customer satisfaction, leading in market share, leading in sales, leading in profits, but ultimately what's important is, are we leading in our ability to improve? Because leadership in those categories means nothing if someone who is less good than we are right now is improving at a faster rate. Because if they are improving faster than we are, that means that sometime in the future they will overtake us. It's complacence over market share and profits that in the 1950s and 60s led to our losing a competitive edge in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We can't afford to become complacent. We have to learn how to improve. We must become masters of improvement. How often have you felt hopeful when you were undergoing some kind of change that this was going to solve your problems, that you were suffering from something, some difficulty, you weren't able to do what you wanted to accomplish, and you instituted some change in the hopes that this would be it, this would be get you over the hump and help lead you to some state of improvement that you wanted, and only to find out that you were disillusioned, that later on you were disappointed, you didn't get the results you wanted, in fact it didn't make any change whatsoever. Well, there's an illustration of this in your notes. It's what I call illusion, the illusion of progress. We frequently, when we're suffering from some dissatisfaction, when something's not working right, when the customers are unhappy, we frequently introduce some kind of innovation. It could be some kind of a technological breakthrough. It could be a robot. It could be a computer. It could be some kind of reorganization of our groups and reporting lines and so forth. And we put this in place hoping that this will help us make the breakthrough that we've been looking for, only to find out that doesn't work. So we suffer this gradual illusion. What it turns out is we have these periodic infusions of optimism followed by disillusionment. And I think most of our organizations in this country operate on that kind of cycle. No real improvement, but only these temporary infusions of optimism. And sometimes the technological breakthroughs are real. We do have a better product for a temporary period of time. But because we don't know how to manufacture, we don't know how to make the systems work, our competitive edge deteriorates until we have another breakthrough to put us ahead of the competition, and then we deteriorate there too because we don't know how to manufacture. Or similarly, we have some kind of a reorganization in the company thinking that this will take care of our problems, but because we don't know how to manage, we didn't know how to manage the old organizational structure, we don't know how to manage the current organizational structure or the breakthrough organizational structure, what we think is a breakthrough, that deteriorates too. So we have this, all we have is hope, and we don't have true improvement. Whereas our competitors, at the bottom of that same page, you'll see a diagram that shows what our competitors do. For them, they have innovation followed by improvement. They take what they have and learn how to improve it. So that when they have some kind of breakthrough, some kind of innovation, whether it's technological or organizational, it leads to something greater. The path is always upward. The path is always forward. This is the pattern of change in the organizations that are eating our lunch, the organizations that are taking us out of the world market. This is the idea of improvement and change that we have to adapt. We cannot settle for mere change. The changes we undertake have to be improvements. Is this new? Is the illusion of progress something that's only happened in this new industrial age? Well, a year or two ago, I ran across this quote from Petronius Arbiter. This was given to me by someone who was in one of my seminars, and I didn't take note of who it was that gave it to me. I would give him credit now if I had his name. Petronius Arbiter wrote in Satyricon in 66 AD, "We trained hard, but it seemed that every time we were beginning to form up into teams, we would be reorganized. I was to learn later in life that we tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing, and the wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralization." It sounds like Petronius might just as well be named Joe and live in the United States in the 1990s. That's the way we approach change often in the Western society, but I think it happens all over. If you don't know how to improve, that doesn't stop somebody from changing. Let's just shake things up and do them differently and see what happens. I want to walk through a case with you, and I would like to tell you that this case was made up, but in fact it's not made up. I want to look at an example of a typical improvement effort. And this was, in fact, in the the words of the columnist David Barry, I am not making this up. This is a true story from a Fortune 500 company. And I call it the mock case, or the main office communications case. Top management was dissatisfied with its ability to transmit important information down through the organization. Therefore, they established the main office communications team. The mission of this team: to encourage work group meetings among the various staffs in the main office and to train key people in meeting skills. So they undertook their task, and the mock team did the following. They met with key people in the main office to identify the natural staff groups. For each of these staff groups, they selected 3 key people to receive training in meeting management techniques, discussion leadership skills, and following this training, the MOC team monitored the results, and they were able to document the following. Within 2 months, all the 45 people had completed the training. As a result of the training, 13 of the 15 staff groups that they had identified were holding weekly staff meetings. An employee survey showed that morale had improved to an average of 4.87 from an average of 2.16. This is on a 6-point scale. Morale had gone up about 2 points. So, 2 points on a 6-point scale. Encouraged by its success, the mock team, with management's blessings, has begun exploring options for a main office communications newsletter. Isn't that special? So there it is. Is this project all that unusual? Have you seen projects like this before? Perhaps you're sitting there saying, what's wrong with that? Sounds like they did a good job. Well, I want to talk about what's wrong with this project. What's wrong with this picture? First of all, an ill-defined problem. Top management's dissatisfied with the ability to communicate important information, but what does that mean? What kind of information, for instance? Next, there's no goal. There's no description of the desired state. How will they know when they're successful? How will they know when there's been an improvement? Third, what value does this effort add to the business and its customers? Will the customers give a rat's tush if this project is successful? Fourth, the mission of this team is not to solve a problem, but to implement 2 solutions. 2 solutions. One solution is training. The other solution is meetings. They would do better to start with the problem. Next, the solutions that are selected are not clearly related to the problem. The problem is managers' dissatisfaction with their ability to communicate important information. But what's the connection between these meetings and the ability to communicate information? Next, the results are not clearly related to the solution or the problem. Do we know whether the morale is related to the meetings? We don't know that. And anyway, how about the dissatisfaction with communicating to the meetings and so forth? Where's the results with regard to managers' dissatisfaction or satisfaction in communicating information? Next, the use of junk data. Just because it's a number doesn't mean it's data. And the data in this case has to do with some survey of morale and counting the number of people who get training and the number of people who have meetings. Data or numbers at least, which tell you nothing. The USA Today would be envious of such data. So, having introduced one illusion of progress, the mock team moves on to another illusion of progress, from meetings and training to newsletters. Now, I have nothing against training. I do it for a living a lot. And I have nothing against newsletters. And I have nothing against meetings. I teach people how to have good meetings. The point is that there ought to be some connection between the problems that the company is experiencing and the needs of the customer on the one hand, and the solutions that they implement on the other hand. And with the mock team, there is no connection to anything. It's just people doing something in the hopes that it will make a difference. It's a temporary infusion of optimism, and and it will likely lead to no improvement whatsoever. And even worse, what if it leads to improvement? They won't know whether the improvement comes from their efforts or from something else that they didn't take into consideration. So the mock team is substituting an illusion of progress, training, and meetings for improvement. Now on page 13, there's a list of a variety of things. Each by itself could be the best thing to do, an important thing to do, but could also be illusions of progress. Hardware, software, robotics, worker involvement, empowerment, all of these things are buzzwords and currently popular things to do. But if they're done without thought, without planning, without analysis, without any logic or data, they could just simply be a temporary infusion of optimism that lead to no improvement whatsoever. So how do you know the difference? How do you know the difference between change and improvement? Well, that's what I want to talk about right now. I think there are 5 characteristics or ingredients to true improvement. And I want to spend a little time on each of these. The first ingredient of true improvement. This proposed change is rooted in a deep awareness of your customers and their concerns and how they apply what you supply. So change ought to start with your customers. I'm talking here about the outside customers, the people who pay for your services, either pay fees and prices and costs, price tags, or people who pay for your services because they're taxpayers. Those folks who benefit from what you do or suffer from what you do badly. How do they feel about what you do for them? Let me give you an example of a change that took in mind the needs of the customers, even needs that customers had that the customers weren't aware of. It's from Konica Camera. The Konica Camera company had gotten a lot of very positive feedback about their cameras. So positive that they didn't know how to improve. The feedback didn't tell them what they needed to do better. So instead of asking people what they thought about the cameras, they sat down with their customers and looked at the pictures that the customers were taking with the Konica Camera. And they'd notice that a picture was out of focus, and the customers would say, well, it's not your camera's fault. You have a wonderful camera. I just didn't focus it right. And then they'd look at another picture, and it was too dark, and the customers would say, well, you have a wonderful camera. It's not your camera's fault. I just didn't have the right lens opening. And they look at another picture, and it was too light, and the customers would say, it's not your camera's fault. You have a wonderful camera. I just didn't set the right ASA rating. And another one had one picture superimposed on another, and the customer would say, well, it's not your camera's fault. I just forgot to forward the film. All of these things which led the Konica Camera to believe that they're making a wonderful camera with which customers cannot take good pictures. So they developed all of the automatic adjustments, the automatic forwarding of film, the automatic focusing, all the automatic settings. And then for the purists, they had a switch that allowed you to do all those things manually if you wanted to be macho about picture taking. But they invented a camera that allowed even people like me to take pictures. Good 35 millimeter pictures. That's unprecedented. So that's an idea of making changes that have in mind how the customers use your products. The same thing could be done with services. You have to go to where the customers are and watch them using your products or your services to understand how you can improve. But that's a good starting point. Most of our changes don't start with the customer. They start with internal convenience in our organizations. And thus they lead to no real improvement, just switching the pawns on the chessboard. Number 2, the second ingredient of true improvement. The proposed changes are important to the business and are acknowledged by customers as something of value. What's the difference between this one and the first one? Well, there's some changes like safety, which are important to the business, but in terms of the first ingredient of improvement, the customers may not notice. The customers may not notice that you improved the safety conditions in your plant or your operation. But if you told them about it, they would agree that that's something of value. And let me give you an example of a change which the customers would not see of value. This is a true story. I was at an airport waiting for a cab, and because there were no cabs available, I called the cab to show up. I called up, I won't use the name of the cab company, I'll just call the color of the cab. I was waiting for a yellow cab to show up. That's not the name of the company. Meanwhile, there was a woman standing out there, and so that I was worried about stealing her cab from it. If a yellow cab came up. I didn't want to steal a yellow cab from her. And I said, "Are you waiting for a yellow cab?" She said, "No, I'm waiting for a white cab." Fine. So we're both there waiting for cabs. A white cab pulls up. She goes to get in the cab. The cab driver says something to her. She walks back, starts waiting again. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Oh, he can't pick me up. He didn't come in response to my call. He's just out here picking up any fare that might happen to be waiting for a cab." I said, "That's a little strange, isn't it?" So a yellow cab pulls up. And I walk over to the yellow cab, and he says, "Are you the guy who called for a cab?" I said, "Yep." He said, "I can't pick you up." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because I'm not coming in response to your call. Your cab is on its way." So there I am standing for a yellow cab, and there she is waiting for a white cab, and there's a white cab waiting for a fare and a yellow cab waiting for a fare, but they can't pick us up. Now, I found out later on why they did that. It was because internal dissension in the cab companies. Somebody would bid on a call, go to pick it up, and find out the fare was not there because one of his fellow cab drivers came and picked up that fare and took them to where they wanted to go. So they introduced this policy, this change in the system to avoid internal dissension in the company. Well, that may have avoided internal dissension, but what do you suppose the customers felt about that? As I said to the cab driver, what's more important, to have one of your fellow cab drivers mad at you or to have a customer mad at you? At which point he called up and got permission to take me where I wanted to go. I suppose the other solution would have been I could have gotten in the white cab, she could have gotten in the yellow cab, and we could have gone our merry ways. So, are these important? Not only important to the business, and there's a lot of changes that are important to the business, but would your customers recognize that they're important to the business? That's one of the questions I would have you ask. Third, the third ingredient of true improvement. The approach to change is disciplined, logical, data-based, and addresses the deep causes of whatever it is that's in need of remedy. And we're going to be talking a lot about this during the course of the day. I'll give you lots of tools and suggestions and ways of approaching changes and using data and logic. Here's one of the areas, among others, that the mock team struck out on. They used no disciplined, logical, data-based approaches. They didn't look for the deep causes of the problems of communication. Neither did they do a very good job of checking out to see whether the customers cared about the work that they were doing. So we'll spend a lot of time on this number 3 ingredient. Let's move to the 4th ingredient. The change that you're undertaking is supported by subject matter expertise and a deep understanding of how change in one operation affects other interdependent processes in the system. As Dr. Deming says, there's no substitute for knowledge. So that if you're going to be changing something in a manufacturing process that depends quite a bit on chemistry or electronics or some technical area of expertise, you have to have that. It's not enough for amateurs to try to do studies on how to change processes where they don't understand the science behind it. Similarly, there's a systems view that's important, and this is something that's frequently missed in changes. That is, somebody may have subject matter expertise in this part of the operation and make changes that make sense in terms of subject matter expertise into that part of the operation, but they don't take into consideration that what happens here affects what happens here and what happens here. So the changes upstream contaminate things downstream. So that's what I mean by a systems view of the organization. It's important to have a systems view of the changes that you make, even changes that make sense here. It's not enough for them to make sense here. They have to make sense in terms of what happens in the entire system. That's a frequently, I think, violated point with regard to change. People not understanding the systemic view of change. And the 5th, the final ingredient of true improvement, the change, its good intentions, the deeper knowledge that you have, the improved methods that you've learned, must be translated into a clear, graphic picture of a new standardized operational procedure. It's not enough to know what the right thing to do is. You have to do it. A lot of proposed changes don't end up as improvements because they never get implemented. There's no method for applying the newfound way to do work, the improvement. So a lot of flurry and activity and energy is spent coming up with a change that goes nowhere because it doesn't get applied. So, we're about to go to section 2, but remember the key ingredient number 3 on the list that we just read has to do with a disciplined, logical, data-based approach that addresses the deep causes of problems. And we're about to go into section 2 of the seminar where we talk about the logic of improvement. The logic of improvement. So let's pause for a few seconds before we begin section 2. We're ready now for section 2, the logic of improvement. And here we want to talk about the 7-step method. 7-step method is something that we have been learning more and more about at Joint Associates over the last few years. It's not in the team handbook, though we'll talk about how the team handbook has relevance to the 7-step method later on. We have found that the 7-step method accelerates the ability of our clients to make improvements. Our clients have found this to be a very, very powerful method and tool and way of thinking about improvements. There's a history to the 7-step method, by the way. Dr. Ishikawa, in his book, What is Total Quality Control, has a logic of improvement that's 9 steps long. And Dr. Kume, in his book, has a 7-step method that's very much like the one we're going to cover. Florida Power and Light, the only American company that's won the Deming Prize, has also used a 7-step that's very much like Kume's and very much like the one that you're going to see. They're virtually identical. And as I said, companies that try this have found that they used to waste more time and take more time to make improvements, but using the 7-step method, it accelerates the speed of improvement as well as raises the chances of them being successful in finding improvements for whatever problems they find themselves facing. So let's take a look at the 7 steps. There they are in one picture, and we're going to go through them one step at a time. So let's look at step 1, called the project. The first part of it is, what is the problem or the gap? That is, what pain are you suffering, and what gap is there between what you have and what you would like to have? Second, why is this project important? Who cares about it? If nobody cares about it, then it's probably not worth undertaking. Third, among the people who should care are the customers. How does it affect the customers? Do the customers give a rat's tush about this? Fourth, how will progress get measured? How will you know if you're making progress? How will you know when you're finished? How will you know when you've got improvements? And fifth, how much progress is needed? How much of the problem needs to be solved? Sometimes it's a problem that never ends, but you want to make a certain amount of headway. So all of this has to do with defining the effort underway. If you don't do this, if you don't do step 1, then you're liable to be stuck with these huge, what we call boil the ocean kinds of improvement efforts, rather than something more narrowed and more focused. Solve world hunger. Well, you just can't do it. And most of the improvement efforts in companies that I see, the most common mistake in improvement efforts is to try to take on something just too large in scope. It's impossible to make improvements on these huge, massive systems. You have to take it one bite, one chunk at a time. And that's what the first step assures that you'll do. To take one bite of the problem and take something that's important to the customers, important to the people in the company. Regarding the main office communications team, they would have done well in step 1 to ask things like, what's not being communicated? Who cares about this? What is the gap that the managers are suffering from? Let's move on now to step 2 of the 7-step method. Once you've defined the project in step 1, you move on to analyze the current situation and ask such questions as, what's the history of this problem? Is there a useful sketch? That is, perhaps a flow chart to describe the system which is having the problems. Sometimes a useful sketch could take the form of an organizational chart. Whatever will draw a picture of the situation in which you're experiencing problems. Third, and very important, is to localize the conditions. What is the problem? What is not the problem that could be the problem? Where is the problem? When is the problem? With whom does this problem exist? What people are experiencing it? And using a kind of logic that you can learn from Kepner-Trago's book, what's happening, what's not happening, where is it happening, where isn't it happening, when is it happening, when is it not happening, with whom is it happening, with whom is it not happening, and so forth. Those things will help you narrow down and localize the conditions. Next, narrow the focus. You'll notice step 2 deals with entirely the narrowing and further refining and defining of this problem. Constantly using data to find out more and more where you're experiencing the pain and more precisely where you're going to have to work. All of this really is not, you're not getting to the point where you're making improvements yet. You're just narrowing the focus of where it is you have to search for causes of problems. Let's look again at the main office communications team. They could have benefited from taking a look at what is being communicated successfully, what's not being communicated successfully, which groups or targets of communication are not being communicated with. So who's receiving the messages, who's not, what kind of messages are being received, what kind of messages aren't being received. It's much different, for instance, to undertake a project that says improve communications in the main office than it is, let's say, if as a result of steps 1 and 2, they found out that what they were trying to do was to more successfully communicate production changes to the 3rd shift. That's much more focused. They're talking about a very specific kind of communication, and they have a much better chance of solving that specific issue than the whole issue of communications. See, right now, they don't know, the management, the main office communications team didn't know whether it was a problem of the way messages were being sent or the way they were being received, and they would have no way of knowing that because they hadn't narrowed it. They hadn't done step 2. Now, step 3. By the way, step 3 has to do with analyzing the causes. The first 2 steps should take the longest time. If the first 2 steps are done well, the rest of the steps shouldn't take much time at all. Step 3 is where we look for the causes of the problem. We've narrowed down the problem, we've defined it, we know exactly what we're looking for, and then we have to find out why it's happening. And here you'll notice the word why printed 5 times on your screen. It's a technique that we have learned from Professor Imai, one of the Japanese professors who teaches improvement. Ask the question why 5 times. There's a puddle of oil on the floor. Well, why is there a puddle of oil on the floor? Well, because there's a leak in the machine. Well, why is there a leak in the machine? Well, there's a leak in the machine because it's got a defective gasket. Why is there a defective gasket? Because it's a cheaply manufactured gasket. Well, why are we buying cheaply manufactured gaskets? Because we have a purchase policy that says low bid according to specs. You'll notice that each successive why leads to a deeper cause of the problem. So you could start out with a puddle of oil problem, but you end up with a purchasing policy problem. In this country, typically we keep asking why until we come up with a who. We have a passion for the culprit. If we ask why with regard, for instance, to the Valdez disaster, most people were content that they found the cause of the problem as soon as they had the name of a person, Captain Hazelwood. That's not good enough. Why can a disaster of such magnitude occur because of a Captain Hazelwood? What are the backup systems? What are the systems for screening people? Recent news indicated, at least there's a claim, that Exxon knew for a long time that he had a drinking problem. But even that's too simple an explanation. It's almost like if we can't come up with blaming Captain Hazelwood, then we'll blame the people who didn't take care of his drinking problem. But what are the systems in place that allow disasters to take place? Ask the question why 5 times. Another example is the Chernobyl disaster. An exhaustive analysis of the Chernobyl disaster turned up the fact that it was an operator error. Well, that's baloney. A disaster of such magnitude can't be operator error. Why can you have a system that allows an operator error to make a mistake of such magnitude? That's why we want to keep probing deeper and deeper and deeper into the causes of the problems, and that's what the question why asked repeatedly does for us. Next, What are the systemic sources of the problem? That's another thing I was trying to say by asking the question why 5 times. But you want to go further into the problem. And next, have the real causes been verified with data? That is, during the course of this step 3, you'll have possible causes, possible explanations for why the disaster takes place or the mess takes place, the oil spill or whatever. But it's important to verify that with data. The opinions on the causes are not enough. You have to use data. And that's where the statistical tools that I said we aren't going to spend much time talking about come in handy. Gathering data to verify whether or not you have found the real cause of the problem. So with regard to the mock team, we could ask, why were the messages not sent? Or why were they not received if they were sent? And as I've said, it's easier to ask why if you've narrowed the problem. It's easier to ask, why doesn't the third shift get production changes? You can find out that why, but you can't find out why is management having trouble sending communications through the organization. That's too broad a scope. Let's look at step 4, solutions. This is where most improvement efforts begin. They haven't done the first 3 steps, and they start out saying, well, let's try this and see if it works. This is where they start, and this is why most improvement efforts fail. Once you have discovered the causes of the problems, then you can identify what solutions should be considered to deal with the causes of the problems. And it's not an easy step to do this, but keep in mind the causes as you identify possible solutions. How will these various possible solutions be evaluated? There's various tools that can be used to compare one solution to another. How will the solutions be tried or tested? Do it on a small scale first to see if your hypotheses are correct. In doing this solution, who has to be trained and how? Who does the training? Who trains the trainers? And then finally, what's the plan for improvement? What's the plan for implementing this solution that you've come up with? This is important, as we'll see later on. When you look at the results, you want to, and we'll see this in the next step, you want to not only know if you got the results you wanted, but you want to know if you got the results that you wanted by using the plan that you devised. So having a plan for improvement, all the steps that you're going to undertake in this new method that you have finally selected. Step 5, results. This is interesting. Step 5 is usually skipped also. A lot of times we'll put something new in place and then not bother to stick around to see if it makes any difference. And it's only later on when we discover we had the same old problems we used to that we determine that, oh, that didn't work, let's try something else. So, first, has there been an analysis of the progress? Have we gathered data to see if there has been progress? Has there been an analysis of deviations from the improvement plan? That's what the work of step 5 is. So go study the results and compare them. Compare them to the gap that you identified in step 1. Compare them to what you saw when you analyzed the current situation in step 2. And then ask, did we follow our plan? It's unfortunate when you get to this point if you don't get the results that you wanted, if you didn't bridge any distance in the gap. If you did a good job of steps 1, 2, and 3, you should be successful in step 4. But what's worse is to get the results, maybe not worse, but it's almost as bad, is to get the results that you want, but not by following your plan. It's unfortunate to get positive changes and not know how you got them. Because if you don't know how you got improvements, then you won't know how you'll lose them later on. And you won't know how to get them again if you lose them. So it's important to have a plan for improvement. That's what you develop in step 4. And then to know whether you followed the plan, or if you didn't follow the plan, know where you changed it so you know how you either got improvements or failed to get improvements. If you don't get the results that you wanted, then you can go back to your plan and say, did we follow the plan? Was it that we had a good plan that we didn't follow? Or did we have a plan that we followed that wasn't a good plan? Those are important questions to ask, and those are step 5 kinds of questions. Step 6 is standardization, and later on today we're going to spend a lot of time on standardization. Standardization is what you have to do to make sure that the new method, the improvement, stays in place. As one of the managers that I work with says, it's putting it to bed. So first, how have the ongoing gains been assured? How do you know that it's better and it's going to stay better? How do you keep it from backsliding into the old method? Second, is there a description of the new method showing who does what, when, where, why, and how? You'll notice by the way that your notes there make 2 bullets out of what ought to be 1 bullet. There ought to be some kind of graphic display of a new method that makes it clear to those involved in this new method who does what, when do they do it, how do they do it, and if necessary, why do they do it in that particular way. Third, what mechanisms are there for error prevention, for monitoring the process and controlling the process? That ought to be part of the new method. It's not enough to say, here's the way we're going to do that work right now. It's here's the way we're going to do the work, here's the way we're going to monitor the work, the processes to see that they're going the way we want them to go. We'll spend a lot of time, as I said, on standardization and some tools for standardization. I think it's one of the other neglected areas when it comes to improvement. The last step of the 7-step method is called future plans, which seems a little redundant to me. I mean, are there such thing as past plans? But future plans. Future plans asks questions like, what's next? What are you going to do now? Now that you have this improved method that's been standardized, what do you do? And what have you learned about making improvements? That's the second point with future plans. Because it's important to learn from your own improvement efforts. Remember I said earlier on, we must learn how to improve. We must become the masters of improvement. Well, one of the ways to do that is to, as we go through the efforts of making improvements, to reflect on what we did. What did we do that worked? What did we do that didn't work? And maintain the memory of improvement so that we can both teach ourselves how to do better next time around, but also teach others in the company. If our company is going to learn how to improve better, this is the step that will help us to learn from our own experience. When you reach this step, there's basically 2 choices. One is to say, there's still some unfinished business. We want to go back perhaps to step 1 or step 2 or step 3 and pick up some other pieces. Perhaps you have taken care of some of the causes of the problem, but there are other causes that you haven't taken care of. So you return to an earlier step and then work on another facet of this whole problem. The other choice, besides carrying on some other part of this effort, is to bring this effort to a close. Now, in the new quality era, improvement is ongoing and never ending, but that doesn't mean projects are ongoing and never ending. So you may reach a point where you say, we only have so many resources to spend on concentrated improvement efforts, and this one has achieved a state of improvement such that we would be better to spend our resources on some other improvement effort, maybe come back to this one later on. And as I said, it's important to capture the learnings. That's when you bring it to a close, one of the efforts you want to make is to clean up your documentation, to make sure that all the bits and pieces are taken care of, to make sure that the standardization is in place, to make sure that the ongoing effort to maintain this process is passed over to those who are going to be working on it on a day in and day out basis, and then to help spread through the company what you have learned with regard to improvements. So, these are the 7 steps. Now let's take a look at page 2-5 and a mini case which I call the honeymooners. And keep in mind the 7 steps as I read through this mini case. First, the safety project team was a real breakthrough. The team co-leaders were the safety director and the president of the local union. The team devised a questionnaire that was sent to all the supervisors and shop stewards asking their opinion of the most serious safety problems. The team selected 3 safety problems to work on. Back injuries, the problem most often cited by the supervisors that they surveyed. Scrapes and cuts, the problem most often mentioned by the stewards whom they surveyed. And then eye injuries, which was the second most significant problem mentioned by those 2 groups. The team then brainstormed ways to improve the safety performance regarding all three of these kinds of injuries. And from the brainstormed list, the team selected 2 or 3 actions for each injury. They implemented those actions, and then following a true PDA cycle, the team carefully monitored the accident and injury rates for all 3 problem areas. And here are the results, which you'll see on the bottom of page 5. This is the graphic, the next graphic. You'll notice that back injuries in February of 89 were 17, but in April of 89, after the improvements, they were down to 8. A year ago, they were 14. So there seems to be improvements in back injuries. Cuts and scrapes went from 32 to 16. Cut the cuts and scrapes in half. A year ago, they were 21. And eye injuries went from 5 to nothing. They eliminated eye injuries. And the total of those 3 types of injuries went from 54 to 24, about a 40% reduction in injuries from last year or from February. So, given that success and buoyed by their self-confidence, they went on to look for other joint projects that they could do. Now, I want you to spend a few minutes talking about this. Here's what we're going to do. I want you to take a look at the form on page 2-7. It asks you to look at your analysis of this team's major issues, and then what are your recommendations for improvement of this team, and use this as a general format for discussing or taking notes on it. We're going to be taking a 5-minute break very soon, and I want you to meet with the people that you're sitting with in your room, wherever you are. And if you don't know each other, introduce yourselves quickly. Meet with groups of 2 or 3. Don't make it a large group. Try to break up into small groups. And introduce yourself to the other person or the other 2 people. And discuss the 2 items that are there on page 2-7. Keep in mind the 7 steps. And also I ask you, don't look ahead at the page 9, the colored page that gives you our analysis of these cases. So if you're ready, we will begin a 5-minute break starting now. Okay, you've had some time to talk about the honeymooners. Let's go through our analysis of the major issues of the honeymooners case. First of all, the team chose to use people's opinions on safety. Now, safety is one of those issues on which there's a lot of data. The federal government requires the taking of a lot of data, and ordinarily most companies have a lot of information on the types of accidents and the frequency of accidents. That data on accidents is a whole lot more valuable than people's opinions on what the most serious accidents are. Secondly, the team went from surveying opinions on what the problems were to brainstorming solutions. No step 2, no step 3, nothing to do with the causes of the problems. And then the next point is that because the data weren't plotted over time, they can't be interpreted as showing true improvement. It's garbage data again. USA Today type data. And how many of you have seen data like this used? This month, last month, a year ago this month, and major corporate decisions are made based on data such as that. Let's look on the next page, on page 10, and you'll see a better example of data. This is safety data from a company, and while it's not broken down into types of accidents, which would be more useful, at least it takes an aggregate of injuries, OSHA reportable incidents, and shows the variation in accidents over time. And you'll notice that in February, the month before this honeymooner team went into action, there were relatively quite a few accidents. In the month of April, there were relatively fewer accidents. Now, I submit to you that this team, the honeymooner team, were lucky. They happened to be operating in between 2 months where there was a high rate and a low rate in a system of fairly normal, predictable variation. You'll notice right after, the month after, the rate went up, and then it went down, and then it went up again. That happens in a system of normal variation. So if you don't gather data over time, you can't tell what kind of variation is built into the system. And even in accidents, you can determine statistically a pattern of accidents, a pattern of statistical data. So what we have here are people who think they've made improvement, an illusion of improvement, which in fact is just introducing some programs, some changes. We don't know what they did, but they did something. But there's no evidence, in fact, in the data on accidents, that what they did made any difference whatsoever. Now, let's talk a little bit about what you would recommend for this team. There's a problem here, just a political problem, if nothing else. They feel really good about the fact that these two sort of adversarial groups have come together to do something jointly. So if I were coaching this team, if I were a consultant to this team, I wouldn't go into them and say, you've done a terrible job, you think you've made improvements, but you haven't. That would be untactful. And I want them to feel good about working together and to continue working together, but have them learn how to make real improvements. They'll feel, in the long run, they'll feel better about working together if they make real improvements. Because this team would be quickly disillusioned, for instance, if they found out, and the data that we just looked at showed that in July or August things got, or rather in August or September, things got worse. And they would say, my gosh, what did we do wrong? How come we thought we made improvements? We felt good about them, but things got worse. So what I would recommend to this team is to do a check. That is, they've done something. There's data available on the types of accidents, on these three types of accidents. Let's stick with these three types of accidents if that's what they want to work on. They're serious accidents anyway. Eye injuries are important. Back injuries are usually cited by the literature as a major form of accident in most companies. Stick with those three categories. Go back to the historical data, find out what the patterns of injuries were, and then take a look at the current data on those three types of injuries and see if there's been a difference. And then go back further and start with step 2 of the 7-step method. Find out more information about the current situation. For instance, with regard to cuts and scrapes, where are those happening? Or eye injuries, where are those happening? And find out at the place where most eye injuries occur, what is the cause of eye injuries at that particular location? And then what can we do to eliminate that cause at that location? And then go on to the next most frequent location for eye injuries and eliminate eye injuries at their source in that location. Then they can start sort of retrofitting the 7 steps into their process and feel good about working together and feel good about now using good data and good logic to make their improvements. Typically, our approach to improving safety problems is to introduce a program of exhortation. Slogans and posters and jackets and parking places, all of which are aimed at telling people, be careful. Safety depends on you. Have you ever walked down the stairs in some plant and seen a big mirror at the bottom of the stairs saying, this is the person most responsible for safety? Well, that's baloney. That's not improvement. That's the illusion of improvement. It doesn't do anything to improve safety. I'll tell you what one company did. They found out, for instance, their biggest problem had to do with pinches to the hands and arms on a particular machine. Well, they got data on where do the pinches and the hands and arms take place in this location. Well, they found out most of them take place there. There was another place that was also a frequent source of those kinds of injuries. And then they went to those locations and said, now what's happening at this location that creates pinches to the hands and arms? And they saw in the mechanisms of that operation those things which created the pinches. And what they did was eliminate the mechanical capability of getting pinches in that location. They changed the mechanics, eliminated pinches in that location. If you wanted to get pinched, you had to go someplace else. And they probably found places to do that too. But the point is that's improvement. That's eliminating accidents. That's increasing safety by improvements, not by exhortation. And then so forth. With the typical eye injury safety program consists of beating people over the head for not wearing their goggles. Well, when you think about it, that may be necessary under the current circumstances, but they wear goggles because something's flying through the air that's going to cause injuries. Well, what can you do to eliminate those things flying through the air so they don't have to wear goggles? If they want to get eye injuries, they have to go someplace else because there's nothing flying through the air at that place anymore. That's what improvement is. Improvement is finding the cause, finding the source of problems and eliminating it, changing it forever. A deeper systems viewpoint. We don't ask why people get eye injuries. We ask who's getting them and what do they do to screw up. We don't ask the question why 5 times. We ask the question who once. Now, it's almost lunchtime. We're going to be breaking for lunch in roughly 20 minutes. And I want to give you some food for thought as well as food for lunch. And we have a couple more mini cases that I want you to talk about in the same way that you briefly talked about the honeymooners. And I'll go through the mini cases with you. And again, in the immortal words of Dave Barry, I'm not making these up. None of these cases, unfortunately, are made up. But let's talk about the mini case number 1, which you'll see on page 3, the case of the flawed products and the flawed experts. And I'll read through the case again, and then what I want you to do during lunch is go through and make your notes and your analysis, and then over lunch, if you have an opportunity to talk with somebody who's at your downlink site, have lunch with them and talk about these 2 cases, and then talk about anything else you want to talk about. But here's mini case number 1, flawed products, flawed experts. Project team in manufacturing area is trying to eliminate a type of flaw in the product that for years has been a problem with this particular production equipment. Some of the opinions on the team are as follows. The purchasing agent says the supplier insists that we're trying to run the machine too fast. We should simply slow everything down. We may need a second machine to meet the demand for the product from the customers. Maintenance engineer says, George and me could lick this problem. If you give us a day, we don't need to waste all this time sitting around here and talking about the Japanese either. That's an enlightened approach. The operations supervisor says, I talked to my friend who works for a competitions plant across town. And he swears that if we buy an Acme doohickey, it will eliminate this problem just as it did for them. They couldn't agree on what to do, so they finally agreed to bring in a consultant, a professor in the School of Engineering at the State University who's an expert in this type of manufacturing process. And this university professor examined the machinery and recommended several changes that were implemented. And the frequency of this defect that they were trying to beat was reduced. It wasn't eliminated, but it certainly went down considerably. However, another defect previously unseen began occurring in the product. I didn't make that case up. So, I'm going to ask you to talk about flawed products, flawed experts over lunch. And then the other case you will see on page 5, all wind up, no pitch. After a long and challenging effort, a project team identified the cause of the problem and designated a new method that eliminated the problem with no undesirable side effects. So it's not like the flawed products, flawed experts case. And the study was made more difficult by the managers who indicated their indifference to the project in several ways. They asked the team to take on other temporary tasks. They reassigned team members to other projects and not showing up for various guidance team meetings or meetings with the team when the team wanted to make some kind of presentation. They either didn't show up or they canceled it altogether. The team, nevertheless, was proud of that it did its work in spite of the obstacles, and it was able to identify the cause and present the management with the best known method to do the work of the process under study. The new method was carefully documented. The new procedures were mapped out. The curriculum for training was described in writing. Packet of recommended actions were assembled and turned over to the management, and after 3 months, nothing happened. All wind up, no pitch. So that's the second case. Now, as you'll notice, all of these have issues both related to the sort of the politics of the situation, but also, and those are mostly organization development consultant type issues, but there are also data problems. There's also logic problems, and I want you to talk about specifically in relation to the 7 steps, what's missing, what's inadequate, and if you were a coach to these project teams, or these companies for that matter, what would you advise them to do? That's the subject matter for your lunchtime discussion. Right now, Eastern time, it's about 12:15. Lunch is scheduled for 15 minutes from now, but this is in terms of the subject matter that we're covering, this is a good time to break. It's right now in Eastern time zone, it's 12:15. That would make it 11:15 Central, 10:15 Mountain, something else Pacific. I think I may have missed an hour there. We will resume this seminar at 1 o'clock Eastern, which, if my math doesn't fail me, it makes it 12 o'clock Central, 11 o'clock Mountain, and 10 o'clock Pacific time. Anyway, you know what time it is wherever you are, and 1 hour and 15 minutes from the present time is when we're expected to return here, and we'll have some analysis once again of these too many cases that you talked about over lunch. So have a good lunch, and we will be back at, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We'll be back at 1:30. Here we go again. Ready for this? Eastern time zone 1:30, Central 12:30, 11:30 in the Mountain time zone, and the Pacific, whatever's left. You know what I'm talking about. It's 1 hour and 15 minutes from now. Have a good lunch.